Today we're going to talk about how to modify, how to cut calories, when to maintain your calories, when to increase calories, the equipment you'll need, and everything else. Let's get to it. So, number one thing when starting out, we have to have the right equipment to begin with. The things that you will need for this, you will need a body weight scale to track your weight throughout the weeks. You may have already known that. That's all right. You will need a digital food scale because we want to be very accurate in how we are measuring our food so that we can get an accurate representation of the macronutrients that we're taking in and then accurately can modify the amounts. So that's number two. Number three, you will need a calendar or a note-taking app of some kind. So I find the calendar like on the wall, like paper calendar, to be useful because it's in our face almost every day, especially if you have it somewhere that you are every day. So like mine's in my kitchen and I can just easily write down my weights on that calendar. Very, very easy for me. But if you find it easier to track your weight on an app or something like that, also cool too. The main thing is you just need to see it every day. It needs to be in your face. One other thing that we are not going to do this time around is to focus on other variables to track. So we are just going to focus on food and our body weight, and we are going to use that. And from those measurements, we're going to decide what to do next. Other things that you could use, pictures, body measurement, other variables, but for the purposes of this, we're just going to focus on this. We're going to learn this skill first, and then we're going to move on to incorporating those other things like later on deeper into a diet. Pictures, I believe, become more important. And then also body measurements, I think, should be done somewhat, but less frequently than weighing yourself. So we're going to put those things off until later. Underlying assumptions that I'm going to have whenever I'm talking about this are a few things. Number one, you know within reason how to accurately track your calories and accurately how to modify them. That's an underlying assumption. Number two, another underlying assumption is that you know how to weight train and you're doing that 3 to 6 times a week, 2 to 6 times a week, just your regularly weight training. Additionally, this is going to be a theoretical of cardio or physical activity. So we're not really going to factor those things in. We are going to focus on calories first, modifying that variable, and then in a later video, we're gonna talk about those other things. So how do we track progress? The number one thing you're going to do is you're going to wake up every morning and you're going to weigh yourself in the same manner. How do you do that? For me, this is just the way that I do it. I wake up, I get down to my boxers, I use the restroom, I come back, I step on my weight scale, and that is my morning weight. That's it. It is the same thing day in, day out. And then at the end of the week, I can take the average of those weights, and it's a very accurate representation of my morning weight because all of the variables that I can control are controlled. Additionally, you're going to want to put that in your tracker, or if it's automatically tracked for you, perfectly fine. I think we see in the psychological literature that which gets tracked can be changed. And I see this in my clients and my patients. The variables that we tend to track are the ones that we can modify and are the ones that generally change. So if you think that you don't have to track your weight or it's not that important, I think there's a good amount of literature to support that initially, especially initially when this isn't ingrained as an identity, that tracking your calories, tracking your weight is a powerful way to change your behaviors, which inevitably that's the limiting factor in any of these goals that we have. So it is in your best interest to begin tracking so that you can modify effectively. Once you've tracked your weight for an entire week, Sunday to Saturday, Monday to Sunday, however you structure your week, you're going to want to take the average weight at the end of that week. And now you're ready to do something. Wrong. Immediately after our first week of cutting, we don't want to do anything. The first thing we want to do is look at that average, nod our head, and move on to the next week. The reason for that is there are some odd things that happen with your first week of dieting. Really, there's only one thing that happens, and that is a gross fluctuation in water. Whenever you're setting up a diet and you begin cutting calories, a majority of those calories are probably going to come from carbohydrates. Fats and protein stay pretty stagnant for a while, and carbohydrates are the thing that get cut. Cool thing about carbohydrates is they help you store water in your muscles. Well, that's a cool thing because that helps with performance. However, whenever you first make that initial calorie cut, a lot of water is going to be flushed out along with it. That initial week, you might lose 1% of body weight, 2% of body weight. maybe 3% of body weight. For our 200-pound avatar before, 3% of body weight, that's that's 6 pounds. That's not unheard of. I have lost, 5 to 7 pounds in the first week of a diet if I was consuming enough carbohydrates in my diet. So the more carbs you consume pre-dieting, the more likely you are to drop a decent amount of water weight initially in a diet. After we have that first week, we are going to move on to week 2. You take all your weights for week 2 and average at the end. What does this allow us to do on top of not making decisions based on a huge water fluctuation in week 1? Well, this allows us to look at other variables that could have been affected while we started our dieting. Number 1, sleep. If your sleep has been greatly impacted or negatively impacted by some stressor throughout your life over the course of the last 2 weeks, you might want to get that in check first before making decisions about modifying your calories. Number 2, stress. If you are under a great deal of stress, if you were in grad school like I was a year or so ago, if you have final exams, if you have life stress, work stress, family stress, and it all sort of culminated in the past week or two, you may want to press pause and not make any decisions based off stalling out in weight. Think about your stress levels. Number 3, training. Have you been weight training regularly? Now, arguably, this is going to impact your physical body weight a little bit less than overeating or something like that. But if you haven't been hitting your training goals, then why would you be modifying your calorie goals? I think if I was at the end of my second week and I hadn't hit, 100% of my workouts, 80% of my workouts, whatever, if I wasn't consistent, we'll stick with that. If I wasn't consistent, I would consider pausing, not dropping calories, taking another week and trying to be more consistent with my workouts before modifying a variable. Because at that point, you've got the variable of your workouts on top of possibly stalling out in weight. And we don't know what would have, what impacted the most. Press pause there. Lastly, number 4, diet adherence. So you have to ask yourself, are you being adherent to your diet? Now, I've fallen off the wagon in ways in the past. And it's, and honestly, that was the answer. That was why my weight stalled out. Because one, I didn't track a meal. I relied too much on intuitive eating, if you will. And, my hunger signals weren't enough to sort of curtail eating and keep me on track to losing weight. Now, I will say that transitioning out of a diet, there is something to not always tracking calories. Absolutely not. You're not going to want to always track calories. However, initially, when we're first learning how to diet, there is absolute benefit to being able to be adherent to a diet, be adherent to a set amount of calories, and to be able to modify those things. You have to ask yourself also, have I adhered to my diet? And if the answer is no, why would you modify anything? You need to run that back. You need to try at least for another week before you make a modification to the number of calories. Let's get a bit more into the weeds about how to modify your diet. So back to our 200-pound avatar, if you remember from the last video, this individual was consuming 3,500 calories. So what would be a good initial calorie cut for this person? Generally speaking, I think a lot of the literature out there says that a 500 calorie a day deficit over the course of the week will be a 3,500 calorie deficit, and that equates to roughly around a pound of fat loss. So 3,500 over the course of a week, 500 a day. That would be a good initial baseline. Now, I think there is individual variability in that, and I don't think that initial cut will be enough for some people, and that might be too much for some. So you're going to have to experiment with that. But since we're just starting out, it is a good place to be. 500 from 3,500 gives us a 3,000 calorie a day diet over the course of a week. What do we hope our weight will be at the end of the week? So I think a 0.5% to 1% of body weight lost over the course of a week is about the range that you want to shoot for. So remember again what I said before, that first week it might be 1, 2, 3%. Don't worry if it's not. If it's less than that, that's fine. But you're going to want to sort of you're going to want to discount that first week. At the end of the second week, you are going to want to look at a 0.5% to 1% of body weight lost as sort of your goal. So for this 200-pound individual, let's say they drop 5 pounds. That'll be easier. Let's say they drop 5 pounds that first week. That puts them down to 195. Okay, that's cool. No modifications. No need to add calories. The second week, though, about 0.5% to 1%. So a percent is still like 1.95. I'll round that to 2. So 2 pounds on the high end, 1 pound on the low end. And let's say at the end of week 2, they are, 193.5, 194. Perfect. On track. No need to modify there at all. That is a great place to be. And then keep moving on into week 3. A note on if you stalled. So what's a stall? So after week 2, not after week 1, after week 2, let's say that you maintained, well, let's go back to our avatar. Let's say this now 195-pound bodybuilder maintained weight, and they lost 5 pounds week 1, and then week 2, the average weight across the week, not one particular date, the average weight across the week was still about 195. It's like, oh, okay, that seems like a stall. So I would classify a stall as one, not losing at an appropriate rate. So losing like 0.25% all the way down to 0%. So still some loss, but not enough. 2, not losing weight at all. And then 3, even averaging over the course of a week, gaining weight. Now, there are multiple things that could go into this. Various stressors, sleep, what have you. We're not really going to look at that. Let's just look at the raw numbers for right now. And so I would say you have stalled if you either didn't lose enough or lost in that lower percentage, or you actually plateaued or you gained weight. So those are the things we're going to classify as stalled. Then you are going to want to move into modifying again. So how do we modify again? So we have that first initial calorie cut that we did, 500 calories, 3,500 calories across the week. We have now officially, after week 2, we've stalled. What the hell do we do from there? 2 routes. Route 1, you are dieting for 12 weeks or more. For this particular style of dieting, I would say a more conservative cut is in order, because if you're dieting for more than 12 weeks, fatigue's going to accumulate, your decision making is going to be more impacted, it's going to be a longer, more protracted thing, so you want to make more conservative cuts. And I also think the literature supports more conservative rates of weight loss are going to contribute to more muscle mass retained. So there's also the benefit of that. So 12 or more weeks of cutting, you want to go a bit more conservative. And I would say anywhere in the 10% range, 5 to 10% range, cutting calories would be a conservative, nice cut in calories to get your diet moving again. So for our 200-pound, 195-pound bodybuilder who's consuming 3,000 calories, 5 to 10% is 150 to 300 calories. And I think that's a great spot to be in. Now, number 2, on the more aggressive side of things, let's say you're dieting for less than 12 weeks. You're trying to get ready for something specifically. I wouldn't suggest this if you're getting ready for a bodybuilding show, but if you're getting ready for spring break, if you are, cutting for the first time and you only want to diet for 10 to 12 weeks just to feel out the waters, you want to see some appreciable gains like really, really quickly, I would say in the 10 to 20% range in terms of cutting calories. Remember, this is atheoretical of physical activity or cardio, which we'll get into later. More aggressive. On the less aggressive side, 5 to 10%, more aggressive side, 10 to 20%. So 10 to 20% on the aggressive side. If you are cutting for less than 12 weeks, 20% cut from this 3,000, that would be like 600 calories. That would bring him back down to 2,400 calories. All right, that's kind of aggressive, but that's okay. And then, there's sort of that middle ground there. What's that? Let's see here, 10%, 300, 600, 450. So 450 would be sort of a middle ground move. And I think that's also fine as well. So you've got less aggressive, more aggressive, and I think the decision-making on which side to err on needs to be determined by how long are you going to be doing this and how long have you done this. One last point before troubleshooting. We've established our baseline cut. We know how to track stalls, and we know how to modify conservatively and aggressively. What you're going to do after that, week to week to week, is you're going to want to rinse and repeat. And generally speaking, I will throw this in there, and this is something you can learn from 3DMJ, Alberto Nunez. He likes to wait 2 weeks before making any big modifications. So if I went on the aggressive side of things after my second week and I dropped 15 to 20% of my calories, I would say waiting another 2 weeks before making any sort of modification. It's probably in your best interest, because that just gives your body a chance to decrease fatigue. It gives you a chance to modify your sleep. It gives you a chance to focus on your training, and it gives you more time points to average into a decision that you're going to make. I think a week is a bit small of a time point to make decisions about modifying your diet. So I would say give it another 2 weeks. A couple points about troubleshooting. So if you are in this diet and you find yourself hungry, let's take a look at a few things. So number 1, look at your meal frequency. So if your meals are so spread out and so frequent and so small that you are having issues with hunger, maybe 6 meals a day isn't for you. Maybe you should try and condense that to like 4 meals a day plus a peri-workout shake, something like that. Or if you find that you can't you can't get all your meals in, you've planned for 5, but your work schedule and life schedule just so happen to have impacted the way that you can eat, that you end up not consuming calories by the end of the day, then you're going to need to modify that, and you're going to need to condense those meals down so that you can get in the appropriate amount of calories, appropriate being, well, whatever you set your baseline calories at. So you're going to want to take that into account. And that's a troubleshooting thing that people have issues with in the beginning, is figuring out sort of that meal frequency, and that's okay. And then back to hunger overall, take a look at the fiber content of your food. I think a good sort of shortcut for the amount of fiber you need to be taking in is like every 1,000 calories getting in 12 to 15 grams of fiber. I think that scales with body weight. I think it scales with sex. So I would look that up. However, I think in the ballpark of around 12 to 15 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories. So for a bodybuilder here consuming 3,000 calories, that's around, I don't know, 40-ish grams of fiber. Yeah, around 40-ish grams of fiber, and I think that's a good starting point for that individual. If you're dealing with hunger towards like the end of a day, if you find yourself hungry like right before you go to bed, you may want to consider shifting your meals up a bit. So for me, I'm an individual, I wake up and I'm not really hungry in the mornings at all. So I tend to pause in the morning, especially if I'm not lifting. Like if I'm not lifting, I will pause my first meal for a few hours. That way, my eating begins a little bit later in the day and my last meal gets pushed to the end of the day or a little bit closer to bedtime. That way I'm not going to bed hungry. Another note about sleep and stress. Generally speaking, whenever I'm talking to people in the clinic, it's, 6 to 8 hours of sleep. If you fall outside of the range of even 6 to 8 hours of sleep, trying to tackle that is going to be tremendous for your fat loss purposes. It's going to be tremendous for your muscle maintenance purposes, and you need to address that before addressing any more calorie cuts. Now, for some, it's not realistic based on their schedule. However, I would say for a majority of people, addressing the sleep needs are going to make sure sort of moderate how many calories that you can take in. If you are sleep deprived, if you are stressed out, and you're starting to cut more calories, that's just more stress on the system, and it's going to impact multiple things. Tackle your sleep if that has been a variable that has fluctuated over the last week or two before making the calorie cut. Now check out this next video on cardio and how to incorporate that into your diet plan, and I'll see you there.